Hello, everybody. This is Jimmy. We're reading Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and I am happy to say we're on the last final chapter 12, Alice's Evidence. Aren't you excited? It's the last chapter. Now we're going to find out what the heck has been going on in Wonderland. We left off with Alice watching the trial of the Knave of Hearts who stole the tarts, and she is called as the next witness. Okay, so let me just bring this up here a little bit. Okay. This is the analysis of the last chapter. So Alice, when she's called, she goes, "Here." Don't forget, she's a schoolgirl, right? And she's in attendance. She was forgetting in the flurry of the moment how large she had grown in the last few minutes. And she jumped up in such a hurry, she tipped over the jury box with the edge of her skirt, upsetting all the jurymen on the heads of the crowd below. And there they lay sprawling about, reminding her very much, what a long sentence, of a globe of goldfish she had accidentally upset the week before. Now remember, she remembers, but she doesn't remember because she's been changing. But she does remember she spilled some goldfish and they're sprawling about. And it reminded her of when she spilled the goldfish. If you've ever spilled goldfish, you understand what she's talking about. And she says, "Oh, I beg your pardon," she exclaimed in a tone of great dismay. Oh, she's nervous and worried. She began picking them up as quickly as she could. Now, remember, she's been growing. So she's no longer the size of these creatures. She's actually bigger than the creatures, so she starts picking them up. For the accident of the goldfish kept running in her head, and she had a vague sort of idea that they must be collected at once and put back into the jury box or they would die. That's what happens if you don't collect the fish, right? And even if you collect the fish, after the fish, bowl spills, if you don't pick up the fish carefully and put them back into the bowl of water, they're going to die. In any case, she's comparing all these creatures to goldfish, and she's trying to put them back as they were. Of course, then the king says, "The trial cannot proceed," in a very grave voice, "until all the jurymen are back in their proper places. All," he repeated with great emphasis, looking hard at Alice as he did so. Now remember, she's taller, she's bigger. So the king, he may be the king, but he's not he's not as tall as Alice anymore. So Alice looked at the jury box and saw that in her haste she had put the lizard in head downwards. Don't forget, this is the lizard she had kicked through the chimney, right? And the poor little thing was this is Bill, waving its tail about in a melancholy way. "Oh, help me, being quite unable to move. And soon, poor Bill, so she soon got it out again and put it right. Not that it signifies much, she said to herself. I should think it would be quite as much use in the trial one way or the other. This is an important note. Why? Because so far the trial kind of trial is this? There's no evidence. There's the witnesses are pretty much useless, right? And so Alice concludes it's whether he's up or down, it doesn't make any difference. Poor Bill. Let's keep going. As soon as the jury had recovered from the shock of being upset, and their slates and pencils had been found and handed back to them, they set to work very diligently to write out a history of the accident, all except the lizard, who seemed too much overcome to do anything but sit with its mouth open, gazing up into the roof of the court. So he's in shock. Bill's in shock. What do you know about this business? The king said to Alice. So don't forget, she's been called as a witness. The jury's back, and now she's ready to testify. And the king's going to interrogate her and says, what do you know about this business? What business is that? Stealing the tarts. Nothing, said Alice. Nothing whatsoever? persisted the king. Nothing whatever, said Alice. That's very important, the king said, turning to the jury. What does he want them to do? Obviously, write it down on their slates. They were just beginning to write this down when the white rabbit interrupted. Unimportant, Your Majesty, means, of course. He's explaining to the jury what the king meant, because the king said that's very important that she knows nothing. Remember double negatives? We were talking about that a while ago. So the rabbit says, it's not unimportant. He said in a very respectful tone, but frowning and making faces at him as he spoke. Unimportant, of course I meant, the king hastily said, and went on to himself in an undertone, important, unimportant, unimportant, important, as if he were trying which word sounded best. Which word sounds best to you? Some of the jury wrote down important, some unimportant. So the king actually said important, but Alice knew nothing whatever, right, about the business at hand. So that was important, but it's really unimportant because Alice knew not. You see how you get in trouble with double negatives and words? Oh. So Alice could see this, and as she was near enough to look over their slates, but it really doesn't matter a bit, she thought to herself. It doesn't matter a bit. Why doesn't it matter? Because she knows nothing. So no matter what they write, whether it's important or unimportant, it shouldn't matter. At this moment, the king, who had been for some time busily writing in his notebook, so he's not writing in a slate, he's got a notebook, he calls out, "Silence!" And he reads from his book. Rule 42. All persons more than a mile high to leave the court. Everybody looked at Alice. I'm not a mile high, said Alice. You are, said the king. Nearly 2 miles high, added the queen. Do you know how long a mile is? Jimmy wrote a note for you here. It's 5,280 feet. I doubt very much that Alice is a mile, much less a half mile, much less a quarter mile high. She's just taller than the pack of cards, right? Well, I shan't go at any rate, Alice said. Besides, that's not a regular rule. You invented it just now. Look how brave Alice is. She's challenging the king. She goes, I'm not going. And besides, that's not a regular rule. You just made that up. It's the oldest rule in the book, said the king. Then it ought to be number 1, said Alice. Look how smart this girl is becoming. Look, she's challenging the king for Rule 42. It should be number 1. The king turned pale and shut his notebook hastily. Consider your verdict, he said to the jury in a low, trembling voice. There's more evidence to come yet, please, Your Majesty, said the white rabbit, jumping up in a great hurry. This paper has just been picked up. What's in it? Said the queen. Oh, I haven't opened it yet, said the white rabbit, but it seems to be a letter written by the prisoner to somebody. It must have been that, said the king, unless it was written to nobody, which isn't usual, you know. There's a movie, I think, called I'm Nobody. Don't watch it. It's a pretty violent movie. Who is this directed to? Said one of the jurymen. It isn't directed at all, said the white rabbit. In fact, there's nothing written on the outside. Think about this for a moment. This is just a piece of paper that the rabbit, right? This paper has just been picked up. A random piece of paper. Nothing written on the outside. He unfolded the paper as he spoke and he added, It isn't a letter after all. It's a set of verses. Are they in the prisoner's handwriting? Asked another juryman. Now, the jury is actually questioning, the rabbit, the whole thing. No, No, they're not, said the White Rabbit, and that's the queerest thing about it. The jury looked puzzled. The jury's puzzled because one of them says, did the prisoner, the knave, did he write, is that in his handwriting? And the rabbit says, no, the verses are not in his handwriting. And the king says, he must have imitated someone else's hand. The jury brightened up again. Why did they brighten up? This is great evidence, right? Please, your majesty, said the knave, I didn't write it, and they can't prove that I did. There's no name signed at the end. So the knave now is speaking up for himself, saying, wait, I didn't write it. You can't prove I did it. And the king says, well, if you didn't sign it, that only makes the matter worse. You must have meant some mischief, or else you would have signed your name like an honest man. Okay. We're going to stop there with this for a couple of analysis of the last chapter, chapter 12 of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Alice gives her evidence. But before we go, I want you to read this little thing. Jimmy wrote a note here about chance and randomness are usually considered synonymous. In other words, if you think about chance or something random, now what we witnessed here was a random act that this piece of paper showed up. It looks like it's a random act. It just showed up. There's nothing written on the outside. When he opens it up, there's some verses inside, not in the knave's handwriting, but the king doesn't care that he says that if you were honest, you'd sign your name to it. So what we're looking at is chance and randomness, which I want you to think about, which happens in real life. You know, things happen. Sometimes you can't figure it out, or is it because you just can't see all the pieces of the random act? So for example, you say when an accident happens, it's an accident. Something happened. Let's say you're cutting a piece of bread, the knife slips, you cut your finger. It's an accident, right? But the cause of that is the way you were cutting that piece of bread. Something, and the knife, you had a sharp object, it cut your, and you can logically conclude on that. That was an accident? Was that a random act? Or were you careless? Or did the knife, what was wrong with the knife? Wasn't it sharp enough? Because usually a sharp knife would, boom, you're done, right? So, and when you think about chance and randomness in this whole story of Wonderland, the whole thing is chance and random. Her caterpillar experience, the Cheshire Cat. Where is the Cheshire Cat? The king, the queen, the deck of cards. This is all weird stuff happening. It seems random, and maybe it is random. We're going to have to figure that out. But in any case, they can have different meanings in several scientific fields every day, blah, blah, blah. In particular, chance has a broader scope. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of this, but you should know that there are things that look like chance. And what you have to decide, you, not Jimmy, but you have to decide, is there such a thing as chance and randomness and probability? Because this is all mathematical related. Don't forget, not the narrator, but the guy who wrote this story. Eventually, Lewis Carroll was Charles Dodson, and he studied mathematics. So there's a certain mathematics. In fact, there's a certain mathematics to the English language. I don't know if you knew that the English language actually has math attached to it. And Jimmy was flown down once to New Orleans for a client to meet and talk about current limiting circuit breakers. This was a long time ago in Jimmy's past. And he was flown down there, and the first thing he did is he met an engineer. And the engineer shook his hand and said, "How do you do?" Jimmy said, "How do you do?" The engineer asked, "Are you an engineer?" And Jimmy said, "No, I'm not." And the engineer said, "Happy to meet you." And he turned around and walked out of the room because I was not an engineer. I am not an engineer. Now, when he did that, the client started panicking because I was there to write an article, a feature article about current limiting circuit breakers, a very complex subject. And I wasn't writing it in German. I was writing it in English. To write about anything in the English language. What you have to know is you have to know the parts of speech, and you have to know English, subjects, verbs, sentences, complete thoughts. If you know that, if you master the English language, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you, Jimmy's here to tell you that there's nothing you cannot understand. Because if you're trying to understand complex mathematical topics, subjects, they have to use the English language, not just the math, in order to explain it to you. And vice versa. If you're using English, you can actually translate that back into math. And that's what Jimmy proved to this engineer over the next couple of days. And by the time Jimmy was ready to leave, after he gotten all the information and started drafting the article for the engineer and his company, the engineer didn't want to let him leave because he had proved to him there is a relationship between subjects and verbs and objects, just like there is in numerical values, like whole numbers, right? 2 and 2 are 4. There's rules in math, a minus times a minus is a plus, etc., etc. Now, you can get as complex as you want, whether it's in English or in math, but the situation is simple that you can understand these things. There's a certain logic to them. And there is such a thing as randomness and chance. It's called probability. There are probabilities. Just like we talked about I don't want to get too deep into this. I don't want to lose you. In any case, you've been reading with Jimmy. This is the last chapter, chapter 12 of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Alice is giving her evidence, right? This is the title of this chapter. If you look up here, Alice's evidence. Thank you. This is Jimmy. Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com is my email. Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com is my email address. Send me a note. Look forward to talking to you. And by the way, we will take up this mathematical question in the next session. Thanks a lot. See you soon.